The pristine white chapel in Provo, Utah, had never seen anything like it. Sister Margaret Walsh, 82 years old and revered by every member of her congregation, collapsed face first onto the cold marble floor during the opening hymn. The crash echoed through the sanctuary like a gunshot. What the congregation didn't know was that Margaret had been secretly fasting for 17 days straight, surviving on nothing but water and prayer. She wasn't trying to lose weight or prove her faith. She was preparing herself for what she knew would be the most dangerous revelation of her life. As paramedics rushed to revive her, Margaret's spirit traveled somewhere else entirely. In those crucial minutes between life and death, she witnessed something that made her blood run cold. Hidden records, missing children, financial documents that painted a picture so horrifying it would shake the very foundation of everything she'd believed for 8 decades. But Margaret Walsh wasn't just any elderly Mormon woman. She was a former FBI forensic accountant who'd spent 30 years exposing corruption in the highest places. When she finally opened her eyes, she knew there was no going back. The question is, was her vision real, or was it the hallucination of a starving mind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's grandson, David, was the first to reach her. At 28, he possessed the gentle strength that came from years of wrestling with his own faith while trying to honor his grandmother's unwavering devotion. His hands trembled as he knelt beside her frail form, watching the rise and fall of her chest slow to an alarming rhythm. "Grandma, stay with me," he whispered, but Margaret was already somewhere else entirely. In the space between heartbeats, she found herself standing in a basement she'd never seen before, yet somehow recognized. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of filing cabinets that stretched into darkness. Her arthritic hands moved without pain as she pulled open drawer after drawer, each one revealing documents that should never have existed. Financial records dating back 40 years, adoption papers with names that had been systematically altered, bank transfers to accounts in countries she couldn't pronounce, and photographs, dear God, the photographs, of children whose faces would haunt her forever. Margaret's trained eye, honed by decades of following money trails that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden, immediately understood what she was seeing. The numbers told a story of systematic exploitation, of trust betrayed on a scale that made her 30 years of FBI work seem like child's play. But this vision carried weight beyond mere hallucination. Every detail was crisp, every document number burned into her memory with the clarity that only comes from truth. She could smell the musty basement air, feel the rough texture of the file folders beneath her fingers, hear the distant sound of children crying somewhere in the building above. Margaret tried to scream, but found she had no voice in this ethereal space. She reached for one particular folder, marked with symbols she recognized from her deepest church studies, when suddenly she felt herself being pulled backward, away from the truth she'd spent 17 days preparing to receive. "She's coming back," someone said. The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Chen, a paramedic who'd responded to dozens of medical emergencies at religious gatherings throughout Utah County. She'd never seen anything quite like this, though. Margaret's vital signs had been so weak for nearly 4 minutes that Dr. Chen had begun preparing for the worst outcome. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, but instead of the relief David expected to see, he found something that chilled him to the bone. His grandmother's gaze held a knowledge that seemed to age her another decade in mere seconds. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength, pulling him close enough that only he could hear her words. "The records," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the concerned murmurs of the congregation. "Basement level 3, building C, they're moving the children next Tuesday." David stared at her, confused. "Grandma, you need to rest. You fainted. The paramedics are here to help you." But Margaret's grip tightened. "Listen to me, David. I've seen what they've been hiding. What they've done." Her eyes darted toward Bishop Anderson, who stood at the edge of the crowd with an expression David couldn't quite read. Don't trust anyone in leadership. Not until we know how deep this goes. Dr. Chen gently intervened, preparing to transport Margaret to Utah Valley Hospital for observation. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Margaret caught sight of Bishop Anderson whispering urgently into his phone, his face pale and his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that confirmed her worst fears. The vision had been real, and now they knew she'd seen it. As the ambulance doors closed behind her, Margaret realized that her 17 days of fasting had been preparation for something far more dangerous than a spiritual revelation. She'd been preparing for war. The parish kitchen had always been Sister Margaret's sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a tomb. She sat at the scarred wooden table where she'd shared countless meals with fellow sisters over the decades, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea that Father Rodriguez had insisted she drink. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed intermittently, casting harsh shadows across the yellowed linoleum floor. "You gave us quite a scare, Margaret." Father Rodriguez pulled out a chair across from her, his usually commanding presence somehow diminished in the sterile light. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and she noticed his clerical collar sat slightly askew, a detail that would have been unthinkable for the meticulous priest she'd known for 15 years. "I'm fine now, Father. Just got a bit dizzy." The lie came easier than expected, though her voice still carried the tremor from her collapse 3 hours earlier. In truth, she felt anything but fine. The vision, if that's what it had been, clung to her consciousness like smoke, impossible to dispel yet too elusive to grasp completely. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" His question was gentle but probing, and Margaret found herself avoiding his gaze. "Yesterday morning, or perhaps—" She trailed off, realizing she couldn't remember. The past few weeks had blurred together in a haze of prayer, worry, and sleepless nights spent pacing her small cell in the convent next door. Father Rodriguez leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern that seemed genuine. "Margaret, I need you to be honest with me. This isn't just about missing a few meals, is it? You've been different lately. Distracted, Sister Catherine mentioned. You've been asking unusual questions about the church's history." The mention of Sister Catherine sent a chill through Margaret's already cold hands. Had she been too obvious in her inquiries, too persistent in her attempts to access the sealed records in the basement archives? "I've been researching for the centennial celebration," she said carefully, trying to piece together some of the earlier years for the commemorative booklet, the booklet that was completed and sent to print 2 months ago. Caught in another lie, Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. Father Rodriguez's dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her squirm. She'd always prided herself on her honesty, even when it proved inconvenient. Deception sat on her conscience like a stone. "There were some gaps," she said finally. "Inconsistencies in the records that troubled me." "What kind of inconsistencies?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Margaret wasn't ready to voice. How could she explain the discrepancies she'd found without revealing how deep she'd already dug? The missing donation records from 1987 to 1992. The sudden departure of 3 priests and 2 nuns during that same period, with no forwarding addresses in their files. The construction, invoices for renovations to the basement that no one seemed to remember authorizing. And then there was the photograph. She discovered it quite by accident, tucked between the pages of a ledger she'd been reviewing. Black and white, slightly blurred, showing a gathering of people in what looked like the church basement. She'd recognized Father O'Malley, Rodriguez's predecessor, along with several prominent parishioners from that era. But there had been others in the photo. Men in expensive suits who didn't belong to the parish, their faces serious as they stood around what appeared to be boxes or crates. The photograph was dated 3 days before the first recorded disappearance. "Margaret?" Father Rodriguez's voice pulled her back to the present. "You look pale again. Perhaps we should continue this conversation tomorrow." No, the word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Father, if something happened here years ago, something that harmed people, wouldn't we have an obligation to address it, even if it was painful? His face went very still. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the persistent buzz of the fluorescent light above them. "That's a very philosophical question," he said slowly. "But sometimes the past is better left buried. Sometimes digging up old wounds serves no purpose except to cause more pain. And sometimes," Margaret countered, finding strength in her voice despite the tremor in her hands, "the truth is the only thing that can heal those wounds." Father Rodriguez stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "I think you should rest now, Margaret. And perhaps it would be best if you focused on your current duties rather than dwelling on ancient history. The parish needs you in the present, not lost in the past." As he moved toward the door, Margaret felt the weight of his unspoken warning. But she also felt something else, a growing certainty that whatever she'd experienced during her collapse wasn't just a hunger-induced hallucination. It was a message, urgent and undeniable. The truth was buried somewhere beneath her feet, and despite Father Rodriguez's careful words, she knew she couldn't stop digging until she unearthed it. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Sister Margaret lay propped against stark white pillows, her weathered hands folded over the thin blanket. Father Thomas sat beside her bed, his usual commanding presence diminished in the fluorescent light. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his clerical collar seemed to hang loose around his neck. "The doctors say you'll be fine," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Low blood sugar, dehydration. You've been pushing yourself too hard, Margaret." She studied his face, searching for traces of the young seminarian she'd once known, the earnest boy who'd arrived at St. Catherine's 30 years ago, with fire in his eyes and scripture on his lips. That boy had believed in absolute truth, in the power of confession to cleanse any sin. This man before her seemed carved from different stone entirely. "I saw something, Thomas." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the mechanical hum of the machines. During the vision, something that happened 15 years ago. Father Thomas's hands stilled on his breviary. Visions can be symbolic. The mind creates metaphors when it's under stress. This wasn't metaphor. Margaret's fingers tightened on the blanket. "I saw you in the rectory basement. I saw the envelope of money. I saw the man who gave it to you. Tall, expensive suit, silver hair. He was thanking you for keeping quiet about something." The color drained from Father Thomas's face. For a moment, the only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Sister, you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes the mind—" "His name was Mr. Hartwell," Margaret continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "He said the children would never have to worry about anyone finding out. He said you'd made sure of that." Father Thomas stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot. His shoulders were rigid beneath his black jacket. "Even if what you think you saw was real, Margaret, sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices." "Difficult choices?" The heart monitor's beeping quickened. "Thomas, what happened to those children?" He turned back to her, and for an instant, she saw something raw and desperate in his expression. "You don't understand the position I was in. The diocese was threatening to close St. Catherine's. We needed funding, and the Hartwell family had been generous benefactors for generations. When the situation arose, I had to consider what would serve the community best." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "What sit—" Father Thomas returned to his chair but didn't sit. His hands gripped the back of it, knuckles white. Robert Hartwell's son had problems, psychological issues. There was an incident at the church youth camp. A few children made accusations. The machines around Margaret seemed to grow louder, their electronic symphony building to a crescendo. "What kind of accusations?" "The kind that destroy families, Margaret. The kind that close churches and scatter congregations." His voice was pleading now, as if he could make her understand through sheer force of will. "I investigated thoroughly. I spoke to each child individually. Their stories were inconsistent, contradictory. Children that age, they have active imaginations. They influence each other. You covered it up. The words came out flat, certain. I prevented a scandal based on unreliable testimony from confused children. But even as he said it, Father Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. The Hartwell family agreed to get Michael the help he needed. He was sent to a private facility, removed from any situation where there might be further misunderstandings. Margaret closed her eyes, and she could see it again, the vision that had come to her as her body failed. The weight of the envelope in Father Thomas's hands, the relief on the older man's face, the file cabinet where documents had been locked away, never to see daylight. How many children, Thomas? It doesn't matter now. It was 15 years ago. The family's moved on. The children are adults now, probably don't even remember. How many? His shoulders sagged. 7. There were 7 children who said that Michael had touched them inappropriately during overnight camping trips. The number hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Margaret opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes in their surface. Somewhere in the hospital, she could hear a child crying, the sound echoing down the hallways. "The money," she said finally. "How much?" "Enough to keep St. Catherine's running for 5 years, enough to fund the soup kitchen, the homeless shelter, the after-school programs. Hundreds of people benefited from that decision, Margaret. Hundreds of lives were improved, and 7 were sacrificed." Father Thomas sank into the chair as if his strings had been cut. "I thought I was protecting the greater good. I thought I was serving God's will." Margaret turned to look at him directly. "And now? What do you think now?" He buried his face in his hands. "Now I think about those children every night before I sleep." The ambulance had barely pulled away from St. Bartholomew's when Father Morrison locked himself in his office. His hands trembled as he pulled out the bottom drawer of his desk, retrieving a manila envelope yellowed with age. The return address was embossed with the Vatican seal, dated 37 years ago. He'd hoped this day would never come. Margaret's fevered words in the ambulance echoed in his mind. "The children, I saw them all. They're calling for justice." The way she'd looked at him afterward, with those sharp eyes that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul, told him everything. Somehow, impossibly, she knew. The envelope crinkled as he opened it, though he knew its contents by heart. The letter was brief, written in careful Latin script on official letterhead. A transfer order, a burial of evidence, a promise that certain unfortunate incidents would remain sealed forever in exchange for Father William Hackett's quiet reassignment to a parish in rural Montana. Morrison had been young then, newly ordained, desperate to prove himself worthy of the trust the diocese had placed in him. When Bishop Caldwell had handed him this envelope with instructions to handle the transition quietly, he'd asked no questions. He'd simply done as he was told. Now, decades later, he understood exactly what he'd helped cover up. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Father Morrison?" It was Mrs. Chen, the church secretary. Dr. Reeves called from the hospital. "Sister Margaret is stable, but she's asking for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I'll head over shortly." But first, he needed to make a phone call. The number he dialed belonged to Bishop Caldwell's successor, Bishop Reynolds, a man Morrison had known since seminary. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Thomas, I was wondering when you'd call. I heard about Sister Margaret's collapse." Morrison's blood chilled. "How did you—" "Word travels fast in our circles, especially when it concerns sensitive matters." Bishop Reynolds' tone was measured, careful. "I trust she's recovering well?" "She's stable." Morrison gripped the phone tighter. "But Thomas, she said some things about children, about seeing them in her vision." A long pause. "Visions born of medical distress are rarely coherent, wouldn't you agree? The mind plays tricks when deprived of oxygen." This felt different. She was lucid afterward, focused, and the way she looked at me. Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think she knows about Father Hackett." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Bishop Reynolds finally spoke, his voice carried an edge Morrison had never heard before. Father Hackett served faithfully in Montana for 35 years before his retirement. He's been dead for 2 years. Whatever ghosts you think Sister Margaret saw, they're better left buried with him. But if she knows nothing concrete, nothing actionable. And even if she did, the bishop's words came slowly, deliberately. Sister Margaret is an elderly woman who suffered a severe medical episode. Her credibility would be questionable. Morrison felt sick. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing. I'm simply reminding you of your responsibilities, to your parish, to your diocese, to the greater good of the church. A pause. You've served faithfully for over 30 years, Michael. Your retirement fund is substantial. Your reputation is pristine. It would be a shame for either to be compromised by chasing shadows. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison's throat felt dry. And if I can't convince her to remain silent, then perhaps Sister Margaret's health is more fragile than we realized. Perhaps the stress of recent events will prove too much for her aging heart. These things happen, Michael, especially to those who insist on carrying burdens too heavy for their shoulders. The line went dead. Morrison sat in the growing darkness of his office, the weight of 40 years in the priesthood pressing down on him like a stone. He thought of the children Father Hackett had hurt, their faces long forgotten by everyone except, apparently, an elderly nun who claimed to have seen them in a vision. He thought of the families who had trusted the church, trusted him with their most precious gifts, and he thought of Sister Margaret, lying in a hospital bed, probably praying for guidance about whether to speak the truth she'd somehow glimpsed in her near-death experience. Morrison had a choice to make. He could visit Margaret tonight, could try to convince her that visions weren't evidence, that some secrets were meant to stay buried. He could protect the church, protect himself, protect the comfortable life he'd built. Or he could face the possibility that God had chosen an 82-year-old nun to be the instrument of long-overdue justice. Outside his window, the evening call to prayer echoed from the mosque down the street. Morrison listened to the haunting melody and wondered if God was listening to any of them anymore. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and wilted flowers. Sister Margaret lay propped against starched pillows, her weathered hands folded across the thin blanket. The 4 drip beside her bed marked time with methodical drops, each one echoing in the sterile silence. Father Morrison sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, his normally commanding presence diminished by worry. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his usually pristine collar hung slightly askew. He'd been here since dawn, waiting for Margaret to wake fully, dreading what she might say. "You're still here," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison straightened, relief flooding his features. "How are you feeling, sister?" "Like I've been to hell and back." She studied his face with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, "though I suspect you already know which direction I traveled." The priest shifted uncomfortably. Through the window, morning light cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot. In a few hours, the faithful would gather for evening service, expecting answers about their beloved Sister Margaret's collapse. Morrison had spent the night crafting careful explanations about exhaustion and age, avoiding the more troubling questions. "Margaret, about what happened during your episode. Sometimes when people are under extreme physical stress, they can experience hallucinations. Vivid dreams that seem..." "It wasn't a dream, Francis." Her voice carried the steel that had made her a formidable force in the parish for 6 decades. "And you know it." Morrison's hands clenched in his lap. "Sister, you've been through a tremendous ordeal. Perhaps we should focus on your recovery." "I saw him." The words hung between them like an accusation. "I saw Timothy Carlson." The color drained from Morrison's face. Timothy Carlson, the name neither of them had spoken aloud in 15 years. The boy who had disappeared one autumn night, leaving behind only questions and a family destroyed by grief. "Margaret, please." "He was just a child, Francis, 12 years old." Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "He told me where to find his body." Morrison stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. He moved to the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. Beyond the glass, life continued its normal rhythm. Cars in the parking lot, nurses on their rounds, visitors carrying flowers and hope. None of them knew that in this small room, the foundations of faith were crumbling. "Even if what you experienced felt real," Morrison said carefully, "we can't act on visions." The police investigated thoroughly. There was no evidence of foul play. The boy ran away into the arms of someone he trusted. Margaret's words were quiet but relentless. Someone who wore the collar of Christ while harboring the soul of a predator. Morrison spun around, his face flushed. "You're talking about destroying everything we've built here. The congregation trusts us. The community depends on this church. Think about the families we serve, the children we've helped. Think about the children we've failed to protect." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Morrison had been a young associate pastor when Timothy disappeared. Margaret had been the one who noticed the boy's increasing withdrawn behavior in the months before, his reluctance to attend youth group meetings, the way he flinched when certain adults approached. She had brought her concerns to the senior pastor, Father Benedict, a man beloved by the congregation, respected in the community, trusted by parents who gladly sent their children to his special ministry programs. Benedict had dismissed her worries with paternal condescension, suggesting she was seeing demons where none existed. When Timothy vanished, Benedict had been among the most vocal advocates for the search efforts. He'd comforted the grieving family, led prayer vigils, organized volunteer search parties. 3 months later, he'd accepted a transfer to a parish in another state, claiming the tragedy had taken too heavy a toll on his spirit. He died 5 years later, taking his secrets to the grave. "The statute of limitations," Morrison began. "There is no statute of limitations on the truth." Margaret struggled to sit up straighter, her frail frame trembling with determination. "That boy deserves a proper burial. His parents deserve to know what happened to their son. And if you're wrong, if this vision was just the product of an exhausted mind and a guilty conscience, we'll have destroyed innocent lives based on a dying woman's hallucination." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll answer to God for it. But if I'm right, and I do nothing—" She paused, remembering the boy's face in her vision, the desperate plea in his eyes. "How do I answer for that?" Morrison sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain before nightfall. In the distance, church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to evening prayer. Neither of them moved toward the door. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's, casting fractured rainbows across the worn wooden pews. Sister Margaret sat in the front row, her weathered hands folded in prayer, though her mind wandered far from the familiar Latin verses echoing through the sanctuary. 3 days had passed since her collapse. 3 days since the vision that had shattered her understanding of everything she held sacred. The doctors at St. Mary's Hospital had attributed her episode to severe malnutrition and dehydration, prescribing rest and proper meals. But Margaret knew the truth ran deeper than physical weakness. Her body had been failing for weeks, sustained only by communion wafers and the occasional sip of water, as she wrestled with the terrible knowledge that had been eating at her soul. Father Morrison's voice carried across the nearly empty church as he conducted the early morning service. Only a handful of parishioners attended weekday mass, mostly elderly women like herself who found comfort in routine. Margaret watched the priest's movements, studying the man she had known for over 2 decades, searching for any sign of the darkness her vision had revealed. In her mind, she could still see it clearly: the underground chamber beneath the church, the circle of robed figures, the altar that bore no resemblance to the one where Father Morrison now consecrated the bread and wine. She had witnessed something that predated Christianity, something that explained the strange occurrences that had plagued St. Catherine's for years. The unexplained sounds in the night, the cold spots in certain areas of the church, the way some parishioners seemed to change after their private counseling sessions with the priest. Margaret's stomach clenched with hunger, but she ignored it. Food had lost all appeal since her vision. How could she eat knowing what she knew? How could she continue her daily routines when everything around her was built on lies? After the service ended, she waited until the last parishioner had left before approaching Father Morrison. He was extinguishing the candles on the altar, his movements deliberate and reverent. When he turned to see her approaching, his face lit up with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Sister Margaret, you shouldn't be here so soon after your episode. The doctors said you needed rest." "I need answers more than rest, Father." Something flickered across his features, so brief she might have imagined it. "Answers about your health. I'm sure the medical staff explained about what lies beneath our feet." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Father Morrison set down the brass candle snuffer with deliberate care, his movements suddenly precise and controlled. When he looked at her again, the warmth had vanished from his eyes. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, sister." "During my collapse, I saw things, terrible things. A chamber beneath the church, rituals that have nothing to do with Christ." Margaret's voice remained steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "How long has it been going on?" Father Morrison studied her for a long moment, then moved to the heavy wooden door at the side of the sanctuary, turning the ancient key in the lock. The metallic click echoed through the empty space. "You always were too perceptive for your own good, Margaret." His voice had changed, becoming colder, more calculating. 47 years you've served this church. 47 years of faithful service, and now you want to throw it all away. The church I served doesn't exist, does it? It never did. Oh, but it does exist. It just serves a different master than you believed. Father Morrison moved closer, his footsteps echoing off the stone floor. "St. Catherine's has been a beacon of hope for this community for over a century. People find comfort here, guidance, purpose. Does it really matter what practices sustain that mission?" Margaret felt her legs weaken, but she remained standing. "You're talking about evil masquerading as good. People trust you with their souls. And I've guided more souls than you can imagine. The methods may be unconventional, but the results speak for themselves. This community thrives, crime is low, people are prosperous, families stay together. Can your Christ claim such tangible results? At what cost?" Father Morrison smiled, and for the first time, Margaret saw something inhuman in his expression. "Nothing worthwhile comes without sacrifice. You of all people should understand that. You've been making sacrifices your entire life. Comfort, family, worldly pleasures. We simply ask for different offerings." The temperature in the church seemed to drop, and Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She thought of all the families who had found solace within these walls, all the children who had been baptized here, all the couples who had spoken their wedding vows before this altar. How many of them knew the truth? How many were willing participants in whatever dark compact kept their community sheltered from the troubles that plagued the outside world? "You're going to kill me," she said simply. "That depends entirely on you, Sister Margaret." The rectory's kitchen felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, as if the familiar space had transformed into something foreign and threatening. Sister Margaret moved carefully between the counter and stove, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared Father Morrison's morning coffee. The vision from 3 days ago still haunted her, those children's faces, their desperate pleas, the way they'd reached for her with such hope in their eyes. She'd barely slept since the collapse. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them again, 12 children who had disappeared from St. Bartholomew's orphanage between 1962 and 1965. Children the church had claimed were successfully adopted by loving families. Children whose faces she now knew told a very different story. The coffee maker gurgled to life as footsteps echoed down the hallway. Father Morrison appeared in the doorway, already dressed despite the early hour. His usually pristine appearance seemed somehow disheveled, his silver hair uncombed and dark circles shadowing his eyes. "You're up early, sister," he said, settling into his chair at the small breakfast table. "I couldn't sleep." She placed the steaming mug before him, noting how his hands shook slightly as he reached for it. "Father, I need to ask you something." His body went rigid. "Of course." "The orphanage records from the 1960s. I've been trying to locate them for the historical documentation project. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might know where they're stored." Father Morrison took a long sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "Those records were damaged in the basement flooding of '78. Most everything from that era was lost, I'm afraid." Margaret felt her heart sink, though something in his too quick response made her suspicious. "All of them? Even the adoption paperwork?" "Yes. Quite tragic, really. Decades of history gone." He stood abruptly, leaving his coffee barely touched. "I should prepare for morning mass. Thank you for the coffee, sister." She watched him leave, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he'd avoided direct eye contact. In 43 years of religious life, she'd developed an acute sense for when someone was hiding something. Father Morrison was definitely hiding something. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt anything but routine. During Mass, Margaret found herself studying the congregation with new eyes. How many of them knew about the orphanage? How many had been there long enough to remember those missing years? Mrs. Kowalski had been a parishioner since the 1950s, as had Mr. Chen and the Battaglia family. Surely someone must remember something. After the service, she lingered in the sanctuary, straightening hymnals and collecting forgotten items while the last parishioners filed out. Mrs. Kowalski approached the altar, her walker clicking against the marble floor. "Sister Margaret, how are you feeling? We were all so worried when you collapsed." "Much better, thank you." Margaret seized the opportunity. "Mrs. Kowalski, you've been here longer than almost anyone. Do you remember the old orphanage?" The elderly woman's face brightened. "Oh, yes, such a lovely place. Those dear children brought so much life to the parish. I used to volunteer there, helping with meals and reading to the little ones. Do you remember any of the children who were adopted? I'm working on a historical project and—" Mrs. Kowalski's expression shifted, confusion clouding her features. "Adopted? Sister, I'm afraid you're mistaken." The orphanage was closed suddenly in 1965. All the children were transferred to the state facility in Millbrook. Quite the scandal at the time, actually. There were questions about the funding, some sort of financial irregularities. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Transferred? Not adopted? "Oh, no, dear. Father Donnelly, he was our priest then before Father Morrison, he announced it during Mass one Sunday, said the church could no longer afford to operate the facility. The children were moved within the week. Such a sad time." The sanctuary seemed to tilt around Margaret. If the children had been transferred to Millbrook, then why had she seen them pleading for help in her vision? Why were there no records of adoptions that supposedly never happened? "Mrs. Kowalski, do you remember a boy named Timothy, about 8 years old, red hair, freckles?" The old woman's eyes lit up. "Timothy Walsh. Such a sweet child, but troubled. His parents died in a car accident, poor thing. He used to help me in the kitchen, always asking questions about everything." "Why do you ask?" Margaret's throat felt tight. "Just curious about the children who lived there." "Well, I hope he found a good home at Millbrook. He deserved some happiness after everything he'd been through." As Mrs. Kowalski shuffled away, Margaret remained frozen at the altar. Timothy Walsh, she'd seen his name in her vision, carved into wood beneath a small bed. But if he'd been safely transferred to another facility, why had his spirit seemed so desperate, so lost? The pieces weren't fitting together, and Margaret was beginning to suspect that the truth was far more sinister than missing adoption records or financial irregularities. Something terrible had happened to those children, something that someone had gone to great lengths to cover up, and that someone might still be walking these halls. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before Detective Sarah Chen as she made her way toward Sister Margaret's room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that reminded her why she hated these places. Behind her, Father Morrison's footsteps echoed with reluctant precision. "I still don't understand why this is necessary," he said. for the third time since they'd left the parking garage. Sister Margaret is recovering from malnutrition and exhaustion. Surely whatever questions you have can wait. Sarah paused at the door marked 314, her hand on the handle. Father, 3 women have died under suspicious circumstances, all connected to St. Bartholomew's. Sister Margaret collapsed during service yesterday, but not before she started saying some very interesting things about secrets and sins. I'd say my questions can't wait. She pushed open the door before he could respond. Inside, the elderly nun sat propped against pillows, looking far more alert than Sarah had expected. Sister Margaret's eyes were clear and sharp, tracking their movement as they entered. Sister Margaret, I'm Detective Chen. This is... I know who Father Morrison is, the nun interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that belied her frail appearance. I've been expecting you, Detective, both of you actually, though for different reasons. Father Morrison moved closer to the bed, his pastoral mask sliding into place. Margaret, you don't have to speak with anyone right now. You've been through a tremendous ordeal. Have I? Sister Margaret's gaze didn't waver from his face. Or am I just finally seeing clearly for the first time in years? Sarah pulled out her notepad, sensing an undercurrent she didn't fully understand yet. Sister, yesterday during service, witnesses say you mentioned something about secrets before you collapsed. Can you tell me what you meant? The nun was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working the rosary beads at her side. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I saw things, Detective. When I was, wherever I was, between here and there, I saw Patricia Holbrook. Father Morrison stepped forward sharply. Margaret, you were hallucinating. The doctors said I was near death. Sister Margaret cut him off. And sometimes when we're that close to meeting our Maker, we see truths we've been too afraid to acknowledge in life. She looked directly at Sarah. Patricia didn't kill herself. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean? She came to confession 3 weeks before she died. She was terrified, Detective. She'd discovered something about the church's finances, something that went back years. Money that was supposed to help the poor and hungry was being redirected. That's enough, Father Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. Sister Margaret, you're bound by the seal of confession. You cannot... The seal is broken when the penitent is dead, and their silence serves only to protect the guilty, Sister Margaret replied calmly. Patricia found records, Father. She knew about the accounts. Sarah leaned forward, her pen moving rapidly. What accounts? Sister Margaret's eyes never left Father Morrison's face as she spoke. Offshore accounts, money donated for charitable work that never reached those in need. Patricia was going to expose it all. She told me she had evidence, documents. She was scared because she'd received threatening phone calls. The color drained from Father Morrison's face. You don't know what you're saying. The stress, the medications. I know exactly what I'm saying, Sister Margaret said firmly. And I know why Helen Martinez died too. She was Patricia's friend, and Patricia had shared some of her concerns with Helen before she died. Helen started asking questions, didn't she, Father? Getting too close to the truth. Sarah's mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed. And Margaret Sullivan? Margaret Sullivan handled the church's bookkeeping for 15 years before she retired. She knew where every penny went, or was supposed to go. Sister Margaret's voice grew stronger with each revelation. She was old, but she wasn't senile. When she started remembering things, started talking about discrepancies she'd noticed, Father Morrison backed toward the door, his face ashen. This is all speculation, wild theories from a woman who nearly died. None of this can be proven. Can't it? Sister Margaret reached under her pillow and withdrew a manila envelope. Patricia gave me this before she died. She said if anything happened to her, I should make sure the truth came out. I was too frightened then, too loyal to the institution I'd served my entire life. But when I was lying there, starving because the food money had been redirected, I realized that loyalty to corruption isn't virtue, it's complicity. Sarah stood and reached for the envelope, but Father Morrison lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. You don't understand what this will do to our community, to the faithful who depend on us. Sarah shook off his grip, her other hand moving instinctively to her service weapon. "Father Morrison, I need you to step back." Instead, he turned and bolted from the room. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before Father Thomas, his footsteps echoing against the sterile walls like a metronome counting down to judgment. Sister Margaret's room lay at the far end, where harsh fluorescent lights cast everything in an unforgiving pallor. He'd been avoiding this moment for 3 days, telling himself she needed rest, that the doctors required time to stabilize her condition. But the truth gnawed at him with each passing hour. He was terrified of what she might say. Dr. Patel emerged from Margaret's room just as Thomas approached, clipboard in hand and concern etched across his weathered face. "Father, I'm glad you're here. She's been asking for you constantly. Her vitals have improved, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She seems agitated. Keeps mentioning something about documents, about telling the truth before it's too late." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water. "Has she said anything specific?" "Nothing coherent to my staff, but she's insisted on speaking only to you. I should warn you, she's fragile but determined. That combination can be dangerous in someone her age." Dr. Patel studied Thomas's pale complexion. "Are you feeling all right, Father? You look unwell." "Just concerned about Sister Margaret. May I see her now?" The doctor stepped aside, but his expression remained troubled. "Keep it brief. And if she becomes too excited, please call for assistance." Thomas entered the room to find Margaret propped against stark white pillows, her eyes bright with an intensity that seemed to burn from within her frail frame. The moment she saw him, her bony fingers clutched the bed rails. "Thomas," her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "Close the door." He hesitated, then complied, the soft click of the latch sealing them into what felt like a confessional booth. Margaret gestured weakly toward the chair beside her bed. "Sit. We have much to discuss, and I fear my time is shorter than the doctors realize. Sister, you're going to be fine. You just need rest and proper nutrition." "Stop." The command, though weak, silenced him immediately. "I know what I saw, Thomas, in that vision, in that place between life and death. I know about the money." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Thomas felt every muscle in his body tense, his carefully constructed world beginning to crack at its foundation. "I don't know what you mean." Margaret's laugh was bitter, hollow. 43 years I've served this church. 43 years of watching you, of seeing the signs I chose to ignore because I loved this place, these people, more than I loved the truth. But dying has a way of clarifying one's priorities." She struggled to sit up straighter, her breathing labored but her gaze unwavering. The renovation fund, the children's charity accounts, the mysterious donations that never quite make it to their intended recipients. "How long, Thomas? How long have you been stealing from God's house?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to deny it, to summon the righteous indignation that had served him so well for years, but something in Margaret's eyes, a mixture of profound sadness and unshakable resolve, rendered him speechless. "The Martinez family," she continued relentlessly, "they donated their life savings for the new sanctuary windows in memory of their son who died in Afghanistan. $25,000, Thomas. Money they couldn't afford to give but did anyway, because they believed in something greater than themselves. Where did it go?" Thomas found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a croak. "The church has many expenses. Building maintenance, salaries, community programs. Your gambling debts." Margaret's words cut through his excuses like a blade. "I've seen the statements, Thomas, hidden in your office, tucked behind that photograph of your ordination. Such a proud moment that was. Your mother was so happy." The mention of his mother sent a fresh wave of shame coursing through him. She'd died believing her son was a man of God, never knowing how far he'd fallen from grace. "Sister, please, if this becomes public knowledge, it will destroy everything we've built here. The congregation, the community programs, the children's ministry, all of it will crumble." Is your need for justice worth destroying the faith of hundreds of innocent people? Margaret closed her eyes, and for a moment Thomas dared to hope she might relent. But when she opened them again, her resolve had only strengthened. Do you know what I saw in that vision, Thomas? I saw those children in our youth program, the ones whose families scrimp and save to contribute to the church collection each week. I saw elderly parishioners like Mrs. Chen, who brings her pension check every month because she believes she's helping build something beautiful. And I saw them all standing before God on Judgment Day, asking why their shepherd led them astray. She reached for something beneath her pillow, her movements deliberate despite her weakness. Some truths are indeed worth dying for, Thomas, but some lies are worth dying to expose. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have, as Sister Margaret's trembling fingers traced its edges. 3 days had passed since her collapse, and despite Dr. Chen's orders to rest, she couldn't shake the urgency that burned in her chest like a fever. The vision had been too vivid, too specific to ignore. 23 years of buried truth demanded justice. She opened the folder again, studying the photocopied bank statements Father Morrison had dismissed so easily. But Margaret's trained eye, honed by decades of managing parish finances, caught what others might miss. The deposits were too regular, too precise. Every third Friday without fail for 8 months before the fire, always the same amount, $2,847. "Sister Margaret?" The voice startled her. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway of the archives, concern etched across her young face. "You shouldn't be down here alone. The air is terrible." Margaret closed the folder, wincing as dust motes danced in the amber light filtering through grimy basement windows. "I needed to verify something." Sarah approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the concrete chamber. "About your vision?" "About Timothy Brennan." Margaret's voice cracked on the name. "He was more than just another altar boy, Sarah. He was my sister's grandson." The revelation hung between them like incense, heavy and suffocating. Sarah sank into a nearby chair, its metal frame groaning under her weight. "Your sister?" "Rose died when I was 38, tuberculosis. Timothy was her daughter's boy, troubled, angry about his grandmother's death. His mother couldn't handle him, so she sent him to live with distant relatives here." Margaret's fingers worried the folder's edges. "I never told anyone about the connection. I thought I could help him quietly, without drawing attention. But Father Kowalski knew?" Margaret nodded, the motion sending sharp pain through her neck. "Stefan had a gift for seeing through deception. He noticed how I watched Timothy, how I always volunteered for altar boy duties when the child was scheduled to serve." Sarah leaned forward. "What happened to him?" "That's what I'm trying to understand." Margaret opened the folder again, spreading the documents across the wooden table like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. These deposits stopped exactly 1 week before the fire. Timothy disappeared the same night. "You think he set the fire?" "I think he discovered something that got him killed." The words escaped before Margaret could stop them, and she immediately regretted their weight. But Sarah's expression didn't show shock, only grim understanding. "The deposits," Sarah said, pointing to the bank statements. "Their payments, to whom? For what?" Sarah stood, pacing the small space between archive shelves. "My grandmother used to work for a law firm. She said payments like this, regular specific amounts, usually meant someone was being kept quiet." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation that had preceded her collapse. But this time, she breathed through it, focusing on Sarah's words. "Blackmail? Or hush money?" Sarah paused, studying Margaret's pale complexion. "Sister, maybe we should—" "No." Margaret's voice cut through the musty air with surprising strength. "I've spent 23 years running from this. Timothy deserves better." She reached into her habit's deep pocket, withdrawing a small object wrapped in white tissue paper. Her arthritic fingers peeled back the layers, revealing a tarnished silver medal. "Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers." Timothy wore this every day. I found it in Father Kowalski's desk the morning after the fire, hidden beneath his prayer book. She held it up to the light, watching it catch the amber glow. Stefan never went anywhere. Why would he have a St. Christopher medal? Sarah examined the medal without touching it. Maybe Timothy gave it to him before he ran, before he died, before he set the fire. Margaret's questions tumbled out like confessions. I've considered every possibility, Sarah, but none of them explain why Father Morrison was so eager to have these archives sealed. You think Father Morrison knows what really happened? Margaret carefully rewrapped the medal, her movements deliberate and reverent. I think James Morrison has spent 2 decades building his reputation on a foundation of lies, and I think my nephew died because he discovered the truth. The basement fell silent except for the building's mechanical breathing, pipes settling, furnace cycling, the gentle whisper of decades-old secrets stirring in the darkness. What do we do now? Sarah asked. Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting after hours hunched over documents. We find out who was making those deposits, and we discover what Timothy Brennan saw that was worth killing for. She tucked the folder under her arm, feeling its weight differently now, not as burden, but as weapon. The truth had waited 23 years in these archives. It could wait a little longer for justice. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sister Margaret slid it across the polished mahogany desk. Father Morrison's eyes tracked its movement like a predator watching prey, his usually composed features betraying the first crack of uncertainty she'd seen in decades. "Open it," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her arthritic hands. The office felt smaller tonight, the familiar religious artifacts casting strange shadows in the lamplight. The crucifix above Morrison's desk seemed to lean forward, as if straining to witness what was about to unfold. Morrison's fingers hesitated at the envelope's edge. "Margaret, perhaps we should open it." The photographs spilled across the desk like accusations made manifest. Bank statements, transfer records, correspondence bearing the church's letterhead alongside signatures Margaret recognized all too well. Morrison's face went ashen, then flushed crimson as he gathered the papers with jerky, desperate movements. "Where did you get these?" "Thomas Henley wasn't just the church treasurer," Margaret said, settling back in her chair despite her racing heart. "He was keeping records. Insurance, he called it, hidden in places you never thought to look." Morrison's jaw worked silently as he studied the documents. The evidence was damning. Systematic embezzlement spanning 15 years, funds redirected from the children's programs, the soup kitchen, the heating assistance fund. Money meant for the most vulnerable members of their community, siphoned away to offshore accounts bearing Morrison's name. "You don't understand the pressures." "I understand theft." Margaret's words cut through his protest like a blade. "I understand betrayal. What I don't understand is how you could look into the faces of hungry children while stealing their bread." Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He moved to the window overlooking the cemetery where Thomas Henley now lay buried, his secrets finally unearthed. Thomas was getting careless, making noise. He wanted out. The admission hung between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest, a terrible understanding that went beyond mere financial corruption. "What did you do, Francis?" When Morrison turned back to face her, she saw a stranger wearing the face of a man she'd known for 30 years. His eyes held a darkness that made her skin crawl, a void where compassion should have resided. "Thomas was going to destroy everything I've built here. This parish, my reputation, my future with the diocese. One man's conscience couldn't be allowed to ruin so many lives." "Your life, you mean?" "Don't be naive, Margaret. You think the church would survive this scandal? You think our congregation would weather the storm of knowing their spiritual shepherd was a common thief? Sometimes mercy requires difficult choices." Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. "Thomas didn't die of a heart attack. Thomas died because his heart couldn't handle the truth of what needed to happen." Morrison's voice carried a chilling calm. "The digitalis I add to his evening tea simply accelerated the inevitable." The room seemed to tilt around Margaret. She'd suspected, had felt the truth clawing at the edges of her consciousness since her vision, but hearing it spoken aloud made it horrifyingly real. Murder, in God's house, by God's supposed servant. You're insane. I'm practical. Morrison returned to his desk, gathering the photographs into a neat pile. Just as I'll be practical about this unfortunate situation. Margaret's mind raced. She was alone in the church with a killer, surrounded by empty corridors and shadows. Her body, already weakened by her recent collapse, felt fragile as glass. But fear couldn't override decades of moral conviction. Detective Rivera knows about the financial irregularities. I've already spoken with her. Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. But you haven't told her about your theories regarding Thomas's death, because theories require proof, and proof requires someone alive to present it. He opened the desk drawer, his hand disappearing inside. Margaret didn't wait to see what he might retrieve. Despite her age, despite her weakness, she lunged for the door with surprising speed, her fingers closing around the handle just as Morrison's footsteps pounded behind her. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, lit only by emergency lighting that cast pools of amber illumination. Margaret's breath came in short gasps as she hurried toward the main entrance, her soft-soled shoes silent against the tile floor. Behind her, Morrison's heavier footfalls echoed like a countdown. She reached for her cell phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to dial Detective Rivera's number. The device slipped from her grasp, clattering across the floor and spinning into the darkness beneath a wooden pew. Morrison's hand fell on her shoulder like a benediction turned curse. I'm truly sorry it's come to this, Margaret. You've served this parish faithfully. Your death will be mourned appropriately. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and began to pray, not for salvation but for justice to somehow survive her passing. The rain hammered against the rectory windows as Sister Margaret sat across from Father Benedict's desk, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she clutched the manila envelope. 3 days had passed since her collapse. 3 days of wrestling with the divine revelation that had torn through her consciousness like lightning through dark clouds. The vision remained crystal clear. Father Thomas's gentle face, his urgent whispers about hidden documents, and the terrible weight of truth that now pressed against her chest like a stone. Father Benedict's eyes never left the envelope as she placed it on his desk. His usually ruddy complexion had drained to an ashen grey, and she noticed how his fingers drummed nervously against the mahogany surface. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and decades of carefully buried secrets. Where did you find this? His voice barely rose above a whisper. You know where, Sister Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her heart. Father Thomas showed me in my vision. He couldn't rest knowing what was hidden in the bell tower. Father Benedict's laugh came out harsh and bitter. A vision? Margaret, you were hallucinating from hunger and exhaustion. These fantasies, open it. The command cut through his protestations like a blade. For a moment, the younger priest's mask slipped, and she saw something raw and desperate flash across his features. His hand hovered over the envelope, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the battle between confession and continued deception. You don't understand the complexities, he began, but she raised her hand to silence him. I understand that children were hurt. I understand that money meant to help the poor was used to buy silence. And I understand that you've known about this for years. The documents inside the envelope told a story that made her stomach churn even now. Financial records dating back 15 years showing systematic transfers of church funds to private accounts, correspondence between former Bishop Crawford and several families, delicately worded agreements that spoke of discretion and healing while carefully avoiding explicit admissions, medical bills paid quietly through church accounts, legal fees for settlements that never saw the inside of a courtroom. Father Benedict finally opened the envelope with shaking fingers. As he spread the documents across his desk, his shoulders sagged as if the weight of his deception was finally crushing him. Bishop Crawford said it was handled, he whispered. The families were compensated. The priest responsible was transferred quietly. He said bringing it into the open would only hurt more people, the congregation, other innocent priests, the church's ability to serve the community. And you believed that justified covering it up? I was young, scared. Crawford had evidence that could have destroyed my career, my calling. He said we were protecting the greater good. Sister Margaret studied his face, seeing not the confident shepherd who had led their parish for 5 years, but a frightened young man who had made a terrible choice and spent years justifying it. What evidence? Father Benedict's hands moved to his collar, fingering it as if it were a noose. Letters I had written to another seminarian. Personal letters that could have been misinterpreted. Crawford made it clear that my future depended on my discretion about the abuse scandal. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Blackmail wrapped in the language of duty and service. A young priest's career held hostage to ensure his silence about crimes that demanded justice. She thought of Father Thomas, who had discovered these same documents years ago and died before he could act on them. Had his death truly been natural, or had someone ensured his silence permanently? The families who were hurt, she said, they deserve justice, not hush money. The priest is dead now, has been for 3 years. What good would exposing this do except destroy people's faith? Sister Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting after the long conversation. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see the church spire reaching toward heaven, and she wondered how many prayers offered within those walls had gone unanswered because evil had been allowed to shelter there. Faith built on lies isn't faith at all, Benedict. It's idolatry. She moved toward the door, leaving the documents scattered across his desk like evidence at a crime scene. Her hand was on the doorknob when his voice stopped her. "What are you going to do?" She turned back to face him, and for a moment she saw not the man who had betrayed everything their calling represented, but the child of God he still could choose to be. "I'm going to pray," she said quietly. "And then I'm going to do what Father Thomas would have done if he'd lived long enough. I'm going to make sure the truth finally sees daylight." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a judgment being sealed. The hospital room felt smaller with Father Dominic's presence filling the doorway. Sister Margaret watched him enter, noting how his usually perfect posture had developed a slight stoop, how his eyes darted nervously around the sterile space before finally settling on her face. She had known this moment would come. "Sister Margaret." His voice carried the practiced warmth of decades in the pulpit, but underneath she detected something else, fear. "I came as soon as I heard about your collapse. The entire parish is praying for your recovery." Prayers. Margaret adjusted herself against the pillows, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Yes, I imagine they are. Though I wonder if they're praying for my health or my silence." Father Dominic's hand froze halfway to the visitor's chair. "I'm not sure I understand." "Please, Father, we've known each other for 37 years. Let's not begin with lies now." Margaret gestured to the chair. "Sit. We need to discuss what happens next." He remained standing, his fingers working the rosary beads at his waist. "Margaret, you've been through a traumatic experience. Near-death episodes can create vivid hallucinations that feel completely real." The Brennan account. The words cut through his explanation like a blade. $19,000, diverted from the building fund over 8 months. Shall I continue, or would you prefer to tell me how hallucinations can provide such specific financial details? The color drained from Father Dominic's face. He sank into the chair as if his legs had given out. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic beeping of Margaret's heart monitor. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "I saw it all during my vision. Every transaction, every falsified receipt, every lie you told the parish council." Margaret's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the water cup on her bedside table. "What I don't understand is why. The church isn't wealthy, but we're not destitute. Your salary, your housing, your needs, they're all provided for." Father Dominic buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, tears had carved silver tracks down his cheeks. "My sister's treatment. The cancer came back worse than before, and her insurance wouldn't cover the experimental therapy. It was her only chance, Margaret, her only hope. So you stole from the congregation. I borrowed it. The words came out desperate, pleading. I planned to pay it back once she recovered, once I could arrange a loan. But then the treatments didn't work and she died anyway, and suddenly I owed $19,000 to people who trusted me with their lives. Margaret studied his face, searching for the man she had worked alongside for nearly 4 decades. She found him there, beneath the guilt and fear, still the same person who had comforted grieving families and baptized 3 generations of children. But she also saw something else, a weakness that had been growing in the shadows, a compromise that had metastasized into betrayal. The building fund was meant for the new roof, she said, for repairs to the foundation, for making our church a safe place for our community. I know, God, I know what I've done. Father Dominic leaned forward, his voice breaking. But Margaret, if this comes out now, it won't just destroy me. It'll destroy everything we've built here. The congregation's faith, the community programs, the food bank, all of it will crumble. Is that really what you want? Is that what God showed you in your vision? Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the overwhelming sensation of divine presence she had experienced while unconscious. The certainty, the clarity, the sense that truth was not just important but sacred. When she opened her eyes again, her resolve had crystallized. What God showed me, she said slowly, was that secrets are poison. They corrupt everything they touch, even when we tell ourselves we're protecting people, especially then. Margaret, please. I'm not finished. Her voice carried an authority that made him fall silent. You have 2 choices, Father. You can confess to the parish council and work with them to make restitution, or I will present the evidence myself. But either way, this ends now. Father Dominic stared at her, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally resignation. You would really destroy everything we've built together? 37 years of ministry gone? I'm trying to save it. Margaret reached across the space between them and touched his hand. The church isn't the building, Dominic. It isn't even the institution. It's the people and their faith. If that faith is built on lies, it was never real to begin with. He pulled his hand away and stood, his movements mechanical. At the door, he turned back one final time. I hope you can live with the consequences of your righteousness, sister. After he left, Margaret lay back against her pillows and closed her eyes. The path ahead would be difficult, painful for everyone involved, but for the first time in weeks, her conscience felt clear. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly under fluorescent lights as Sister Margaret made her way to Father Rodriguez's room. Her cane tapped rhythmically against the polished floor, each step a deliberate act of courage. The manila envelope tucked beneath her arm felt heavier than lead, containing photocopies of documents that would change everything. She paused outside his door, hearing muffled voices within. Through the narrow window, she could see Detective Sarah Chen seated beside the priest's bed, her notebook open, pen poised. Father Rodriguez looked pale against the white pillows, but his eyes were alert and wary. Margaret knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. Both occupants looked up sharply, and she caught the flash of panic that crossed the priest's face before he managed a weak smile. "Sister Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse, "how good of you to visit." Detective Chen stood, studying the elderly nun with keen interest. "Sister, I was just discussing the recent incidents with Father Rodriguez. Perhaps you could help clarify some details about the church's financial records?" Margaret settled into the remaining chair, placing her cane against her knee. The envelope remained tucked protectively against her side. "What would you like to know, Detective?" "We've discovered some irregularities in the building fund accounts. Money that was designated for the new youth center seems to have been redirected." Chen's eyes moved between the 2 religious figures. Father Rodriguez was just explaining how these transactions were handled. The priest shifted uncomfortably in his bed. "As I told the detective, Sister Margaret handles much of our bookkeeping. Perhaps she could better explain the allocation process. Margaret felt the weight of his implication, the subtle way he was positioning her to take responsibility for his crimes. She had expected this, but it still stung. This man she had trusted, worked alongside for years, was willing to destroy her to save himself. "Yes," Margaret said quietly, "I do handle the bookkeeping. Which is why I know exactly where every penny has gone." Father Rodriguez's smile faltered slightly. Detective Chen leaned forward, sensing the shift in the room's dynamics. 3 years ago," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger, "I noticed discrepancies in our accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. Money donated specifically for church improvements was being transferred to personal accounts." "Sister," Father Rodriguez interrupted, his tone warning, "you're not well. The stress of recent events, your collapse—" "I'm quite well enough to read bank statements," Margaret cut him off sharply. "Quite well enough to follow paper trails. And quite well enough to know when someone is stealing from the poor." Detective Chen's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. "Sister, do you have documentation of these irregularities?" Margaret's hand tightened on the envelope. This was the moment of no return. Once she handed over these documents, there would be no protecting the church from scandal, no shielding the congregation from the truth. But there would also be no more lies, no more stolen money, no more betrayal of the trust placed in them. "Margaret, please." Father Rodriguez's voice was barely a whisper now. "Think about what you're doing. Think about the church, about the faithful. Is exposing this worth destroying everything we've built?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the spiritual leader she had respected, but a frightened man who had been caught. His concern wasn't for the church or the congregation, it was for himself. "The church isn't built on stolen money and lies, Father," she said firmly. "It's built on truth, on service, on caring for those in need. You've forgotten that." She turned to Detective Chen and slowly withdrew the envelope. "These are copies of bank statements, transfer receipts, and correspondence I found in Father Rodriguez's office. They document the systematic theft of over $40,000 from church funds over the past 3 years. Father Rodriguez closed his eyes, his face crumpling. "The gambling debts," he whispered. "I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed. I never meant for it to go this far." "Gambling debts?" Detective Chen looked up from the documents Margaret had handed her. "There's a poker game that runs in the back room of Moretti's restaurant," Margaret explained. "I believe Father Rodriguez became involved and found himself in financial trouble. Rather than seek help, he chose to steal from the congregation." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of medical monitors. Father Rodriguez had turned his face to the wall, unable to meet their eyes. Detective Chen closed her notebook with a sharp snap. "Father Rodriguez, I'll need to speak with you officially once you're discharged. For now, consider yourself under investigation for embezzlement." As the detective prepared to leave, she paused beside Margaret's chair. "Sister, this couldn't have been easy for you." Margaret looked down at her weathered hands, thinking of all the difficult truths that had led to this moment. "Detective, I've learned that sometimes protecting what we love means being willing to watch it break. But only broken things can be truly rebuilt." The rectory felt suffocating as Sister Margaret sat across from Father Vincent, the manila folder between them like a chasm. His face had aged years in the past hour, deep lines etched around his eyes as he stared at the damning photographs she'd placed before him. "How long have you known?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I saw it all during my vision," Margaret replied, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap. "The children, the money transfers, the cover-ups, everything." Father Vincent's shoulders sagged. For 30 years, he had been the spiritual leader of St. Bartholomew's, beloved by his congregation, trusted by parents who sent their children to Sunday school without hesitation. Now, confronted with evidence of his crimes, the mask finally slipped away. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "It was never supposed to go this far. The first time, It was a moment of weakness. The boy reminded me of myself at that age, so lost, so vulnerable. Margaret's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain steady. And the others? Were they all moments of weakness? His silence was answer enough. She counted 12 victims in her mind, 12 innocent souls whose trust had been shattered. Some had tried to speak up over the years, but their voices had been silenced by the very institution meant to protect them. The diocese knew, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. Bishop Matthews, the financial committee, even some of the senior clergy. They moved you here from St. Augustine's after the first allegations surfaced there. Father Vincent's head snapped up, eyes flashing with desperate anger. You think it's that simple? You think I wanted this? I've prayed every day for forgiveness, for strength to resist these urges. But the church? They said it was better to handle it quietly. No scandal, no destroyed faith, just a fresh start. A fresh start that put more children at risk. Margaret's voice was steel now. How many fresh starts have you had, Vincent? How many parishes before St. Augustine's? The question hung in the air like a blade. Father Vincent buried his face in his hands, and when he looked up, tears streamed down his cheeks. 4, he whispered. 4 parishes over 20 years. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. 20 years of systematic abuse, covered up and enabled by the very institution she had devoted her life to serving. Her vision had shown her the vast network of complicity, bank records showing hush money payments to families, transferred documents shuffled through ecclesiastical bureaucracy, even altered personnel files. The Hendricks family, Margaret said quietly. Their son, Timothy. You paid them $50,000 to keep quiet. They were going to destroy everything, Father Vincent said, his composure cracking further. The boy was troubled anyway. His parents saw an opportunity. He was 8 years old when it started. Margaret's voice was barely controlled fury now. 8 years old, and you convinced everyone he was lying because he'd acted out before. I never meant for any of this to happen. I'm sick, Margaret. I need help, not judgment. Margaret stood slowly, her arthritic joints protesting, but her resolve unwavering. You're right about one thing, Vincent. You are sick, but that doesn't excuse what you've done or what the church has allowed you to continue doing. Father Vincent's demeanor suddenly shifted, the vulnerable mask falling away to reveal something colder underneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with, old woman. Do you think you're the first person to discover uncomfortable truths about the clergy? Do you know what happened to Sister Catherine at St. Augustine's when she started asking too many questions? A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Sister Catherine had died in a car accident 3 years ago. A terrible tragedy, everyone had said. A moment of inattention on a rainy night. The church protects itself, Margaret. It always has. These documents you think are so damaging, they can disappear. Your credibility as an elderly woman suffering from malnutrition and possible hallucinations can be called into question. And accidents, well, they happen more often than you might think. Margaret felt fear creep up her throat, but she pushed it down. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you about reality. You can walk away from this. Destroy those papers, forget what you think you saw in your delirium, and continue serving God as you always have. The church will survive, as it always does. And the children? Father Vincent's smile was cold. There are always children, Margaret, but there's only one St. Bartholomew's, only one community of faith that depends on us. Would you really destroy all of that for the sake of a few unfortunate incidents? Margaret stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time not just the predator he was, but the system that had created and protected him. Her choice was simple, even if the consequences terrified her. Yes, she said quietly, I would. The hospital room felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls seeming to press closer as Margaret watched the sun track across the linoleum floor. Father Brennan hadn't returned since their confrontation yesterday, but she could feel his presence, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The other sisters came and went in shifts, bringing her soup she couldn't taste and prayers that felt hollow in her mouth. Sister Catherine arrived as the evening shadows began to lengthen, her usually composed face etched with worry lines that hadn't been there a week ago. She pulled the visitor's chair close to Margaret's bed, glancing toward the door before speaking. "The Archdiocese sent investigators this morning," Catherine whispered. "They've been in Father Brennan's office for hours, going through everything. The parish council meeting has been moved up to tonight." Margaret's heart quickened, despite the sedatives. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. Yet." Catherine's hands twisted in her lap. "But Margaret, there are things you don't know, things I should have told you years ago." The room seemed to hold its breath as Catherine continued. "I wasn't the first one to notice the discrepancies in the books. Sister Josephine saw them too back in 2018. She came to me with questions about the building fund, the same fund you discovered was being diverted." Margaret felt ice in her veins. Sister Josephine had died in a car accident 3 years ago, a tragedy that had shaken the entire parish. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Josephine was asking the same questions you've been asking. She scheduled a meeting with the bishop for the week after Easter that year. She never made it to that meeting." The monitors beside Margaret's bed began beeping faster. "Catherine, you can't possibly think—" "I don't know what to think anymore." Catherine's voice cracked. "But I know that 2 days before her accident, Josephine told me she'd found something that would bring the whole house of cards down." Those were her exact words. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering Josephine's final weeks. The younger nun had seemed troubled, distracted during prayers, staying up late in the convent library. Margaret had attributed it to stress over her mother's declining health, but now those memories took on a sinister cast. "Why didn't you go to the authorities then?" "With what? Suspicions? A dead woman's cryptic words?" Catherine stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "And Father Brennan, he was so grief-stricken at her funeral, so broken. I convinced myself I was being paranoid." A soft knock interrupted them. Detective Santos peered around the door, his expression carefully neutral. "Sister Margaret? I hope I'm not intruding, but I have some updates I thought you'd want to hear." Catherine moved to leave, but Margaret caught her hand. "Stay, please!" Santos entered, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "We've been analyzing the financial records you provided, cross-referencing them with the church's official filings. The pattern of irregularities goes back further than we initially thought. Nearly 7 years." Margaret felt Catherine's grip tighten on her hand. "There's more," Santos continued. "We've also been looking into Sister Josephine's accident. The original investigation was cursory. A few witness statements, basic forensics. But some details that were overlooked at the time are worth revisiting." "Such as?" Margaret's voice was barely audible. "A car's brake lines showed unusual wear patterns. Could have been normal deterioration, but the timing is suspicious given what we now know about her investigation into the church finances." Santos pulled out a notebook, flipping through pages. "We've also discovered that Father Brennan took out a significant life insurance policy on church personnel around that time, including Sister Josephine." The room spun around Margaret. 7 years of theft. Josephine's death possibly not an accident. Insurance policies on the sisters. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. "Where is Father Brennan now?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "That's complicated." Santos closed his notebook. "He's requested sanctuary within the church, claiming ecclesiastical immunity, while the Archdiocese conducts its own investigation. It's a legal grey area that could take weeks to sort out." Margaret struggled to sit up straighter. "He's hiding behind the altar." "Essentially, yes." Santos moved closer to the bed. "Sister Margaret, I need to ask you directly. Do you feel you're in any physical danger? Has Father Brennan made any threats?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. Margaret thought of the fury in Brennan's eyes yesterday, the way his hands had clenched and unclenched as he spoke. She thought of Josephine, brilliant and compassionate Josephine, who had loved the church enough to die for its truth. "I think," Margaret said slowly, that desperate men do desperate things, and Father Brennan is running out of options. Outside her window, the church bells began their evening call to Vespers, their bronze voices carrying across the hospital parking lot. But for the first time in 60 years, Margaret heard no beauty in their song, only warning. The hospital room felt smaller than a confessional booth, and twice as suffocating. Sister Margaret's fingers traced the worn edges of the manila folder that Detective Chen had left behind. 40 years of documentation that painted Father William not as the beloved shepherd she'd known, but as a predator who had used his position to destroy the innocence of 17 children. The machines around her bed hummed their mechanical prayers, while she struggled to reconcile the man who had held her hand during her mother's funeral with the monster described in these police reports. Each page turned felt like another nail driven into the coffin of everything she'd believed sacred. "You're awake." Dr. Reyes appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been buried alive." Margaret closed the folder, but kept her palm pressed against it. "When can I leave? Your vitals have stabilized, but sister, you've been through tremendous physical and emotional trauma. I'd recommend—" "I'm not asking for a recommendation." Margaret's voice carried the authority of decades spent managing rebellious novices. "I'm asking when." Dr. Reyes sighed. "Tomorrow morning, if you promise to follow up with your primary physician and maintain proper nutrition." "Fine." Margaret turned toward the window where afternoon light painted shadows across the parking lot. In a few hours, the evening service would begin at St. Catherine's. Father William would stand at the pulpit, speaking of redemption and forgiveness to a congregation that had no idea they were listening to a wolf in shepherd's clothing. Detective Chen had been clear, without Margaret's testimony about what she witnessed in that vision, they had circumstantial evidence at best. Statute of limitations had expired on most cases. The victims who had come forward were adults now, their childhood memories questioned by defense attorneys skilled in creating reasonable doubt. But Margaret had seen it. In that space between life and death, she had witnessed Father William's crimes with a clarity that transcended normal human perception. The divine revelation she'd experienced wasn't admissible in court, but it was unshakable truth. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Sister Catherine entered, her young face etched with worry. "I brought you some things from your room." She set down a small bag and hesitated. "Margaret, there are reporters outside the convent. They're asking questions about Father William, about your vision during service." "What kind of questions?" "About whether you saw something supernatural, whether God revealed some truth to you." Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. "The bishop called. He wants to speak with you as soon as you're released." Margaret felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. Of course the bishop was concerned. Not about the children who had been violated, but about containing whatever damage might threaten the church's reputation and coffers. She had served this institution faithfully for 63 years, had devoted her entire adult life to its mission, and now she understood that her loyalty had been used to enable unspeakable evil. "Sister Catherine, I need you to do something for me." Margaret reached for the younger woman's hand. "I need you to contact every family whose children attended St. Catherine's School between 1980 and 1995. Tell them that if they or their children ever experienced anything inappropriate with Father William, they should speak to Detective Chen immediately." Catherine's eyes widened. "Margaret, I can't do that. The bishop would—" "The bishop would what? Reassign me to a different parish? Defrock me?" Margaret's grip tightened. "Child, I'm 82 years old and I nearly died 3 days ago. What exactly do you think they can take from me that matters more than protecting the innocent?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Catherine stared at their joined hands for a long moment before nodding. "I'll make the calls." "Thank you." Margaret released her grip and leaned back against the pillows. "There's something else. I want you to prepare yourself for what's coming. When this story breaks, and it will break, there will be those who attack anyone who speaks out. They'll say we're destroying the church, that we're tools of the devil or enemies of faith. Are we? Catherine's voice was barely audible. No, child. We're doing what Christ himself did when he drove the money changers from the temple. Sometimes love requires righteous anger. Sometimes protecting the flock means exposing the wolves, even when they wear clerical collars. Margaret watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Tomorrow morning she would leave this hospital and return to a world where everything she'd believed had been shattered. But in the wreckage of her faith in the institution, she had found something stronger, a faith in truth itself, in the radical love that demanded justice for the most vulnerable. The reckoning was coming, and for the first time in 4 days, Sister Margaret felt truly at peace. The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows as Sister Margaret stood before the congregation for what she knew would be the final time. Her weathered hands gripped the podium, steadying herself not from hunger this time, but from the weight of what she was about to reveal. The church was fuller than it had been in months. Word of her collapse had spread through the community like wildfire, drawing both the faithful and the curious. Father Morrison sat in his usual chair behind the altar, his face a mask of barely contained anxiety. He'd tried to convince her to rest another week, but Margaret had insisted. Some truths couldn't wait. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying despite its tremor. "3 weeks ago I stood in this very spot and nearly died from hunger. But as I lay unconscious, God granted me a vision that would change everything I thought I knew about this sacred place." A murmur rippled through the pews. Margaret saw Mrs. Henderson lean forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. Detective Richardson sat in the back row, his presence both reassuring and ominous. "In that vision, I saw our church as it was 40 years ago. I saw Father Benedict, may his soul find peace, and I saw what he did in the darkness of our basement." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I saw the children he hurt, the innocence he stole, the trust he betrayed." Gasps echoed through the sanctuary. Some parishioners began to whisper urgently to their neighbors. Margaret raised her hand for silence. But that wasn't the most devastating truth revealed to me. She turned her gaze toward Father Morrison, whose face had gone pale. "I also saw how the church hierarchy covered it up. How they moved Father Benedict to another parish when the first complaint surfaced. How they paid families to stay quiet. How they chose the institution over the innocent." Father Morrison started to rise from his chair, but Margaret's stern look kept him seated. "The financial records hidden in the basement safe tell the whole story," she continued. "Hush money, legal fees, payments to relocate predators. Our church's donations, your donations, used not to spread God's love but to bury God's justice." The church erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some parishioners stood and began walking toward the exits, their faces etched with disgust and betrayal. Others remained frozen in their pews, tears streaming down their cheeks. Margaret waited for the noise to subside. "I know this truth is painful," she said, her voice now barely above a whisper, yet somehow audible to everyone present. "I know it feels like everything we've believed in has been built on lies, and perhaps, in some ways, it has been." Young Timothy Martinez, now a grown man of 35, stood up in the middle section. His voice shook as he spoke. "Sister Margaret, I was one of those children. I never told anyone what Father Benedict did to me because he said God would punish me if I spoke." The church fell silent except for the sound of quiet sobbing. Timothy's wife reached up and took his hand, her face wet with tears. "I'm so sorry, Timothy," Margaret said, her own voice breaking. "I'm sorry we failed you. I'm sorry the church failed you." Detective Richardson approached the altar. "Sister Margaret, based on the evidence you've provided, we'll be reopening several old cases. There will be investigations, arrests, and trials." Margaret nodded solemnly. "As there should be. Justice delayed is not justice denied if we have the courage to seek it now." Father Morrison finally stood, his legs unsteady. "Sister Margaret, you don't understand the damage this will cause. The church—" "The church," Margaret interrupted, her voice finding its fire one last time, "is not a building or an institution. The church is the people who gather in faith, in truth, and in love, and no institution built on lies deserves to survive. She removed her habit's veil and placed it on the podium. I am resigning from my position here, effective immediately. I cannot serve an institution that valued its reputation over the safety of children. But I will continue to serve God by ensuring that the truth is told and that those who suffered receive the justice they deserve. As Margaret walked down the center aisle, many parishioners reached out to touch her hands or whisper words of support. When she reached Timothy Martinez, she stopped and embraced him. "Your courage to speak today will help others find their voice," she whispered. Outside the church, Margaret paused on the front steps and looked back at the building that had been her home for over 50 years. The truth had indeed destroyed her beloved church, just as her vision had warned. But sometimes, she reflected, destruction was necessary for true healing to begin. The October wind carried the sound of voices from inside, some angry, some crying, some praying. Margaret pulled her thin coat tighter and walked toward her uncertain future, finally free from the weight of secrets that had nearly killed her.